In total darkness, a creature is starving, and the only one who can save it is its closest rival. And that rival will open its mouth and give back the blood it drank the night before, so the other may live. This is not a fable, not a metaphor for kindness. This is the real, documented biology of the common vampire bat. A blood-drinking predator has built a system of sharing more sophisticated than many economies humans have ever designed. What this bat does will quietly force you to reconsider everything you thought was uniquely human about morality. The common vampire bat ranges across the tropical and subtropical Americas, from northern Mexico down through Argentina and Chile. They live in colonies of 20 to 100 individuals tucked inside caves, hollow trees, and abandoned structures across the lowland tropics. Through the day, the colony hangs in absolute darkness, breathing slowly, heart rates dropping, conserving every fraction of energy they have. When darkness falls, they wake and begin the single task that stands between them and death before morning. Unlike most bats that hunt insects by echolocation, the common vampire bat feeds on one thing only: blood. They approach prey by crawling on the ground, a skill almost no other bat species on Earth possesses. They carry heat-sensing organs on their noses, detecting the exact spot where a blood vessel runs closest to the skin's surface. Their bite causes no pain because their saliva contains a compound that numbs sensation and prevents the blood from clotting. Each night, a single bat must consume roughly 20 milliliters of blood, about 1/5 of its own entire body weight. Once full, they are so heavy they can barely take off crawling to higher ground first, to launch themselves into the air. This is a creature engineered to live on the thinnest possible edge between enough and not enough. And it is precisely that fragility, that razor's edge, that created an evolutionary pressure unlike almost anything else in nature. Within the colony, not every bat finds a meal every night. Failure is far more common than most people would expect. On difficult nights when weather is bad or prey is scarce, failure rates across a colony can reach 30% of all its members. This leads to a cold biological fact: a healthy adult vampire bat that goes without food for 60 hours will die. 60 hours, just 2.5 nights, without blood is enough to erase a perfectly healthy individual from existence. This is not a theory. It is the lived reality every single bat in the colony faces every single night it is born into. And it was this reality in 1984 that drew the attention of a young American ecologist to a cave in Costa Rica. His name was Gerald Wilkinson, and what he observed inside that cave would permanently change the field of behavioral biology. Wilkinson documented something no one had truly believed could exist in nature at this scale, and what he found would reshape everything. He observed that bats who had fed successfully the previous night were regurgitating blood, directly feeding those who had found nothing. Not to their offspring, not to their mates, sometimes to individuals with no blood relation to them at all. Wilkinson marked each individual bat and observed, continuously ruling out every possible alternative explanation one by one. After 2 years of data collection, the results left no room for doubt. This was genuine reciprocal behavior, documented and repeatable. Even stranger, the frequency of sharing was not random. It followed a clear pattern, built entirely on the history of past interactions. Bats that had shared with each other in the past were dramatically more likely to share with each other again in the future. This meant each bat was maintaining a precise social memory, a running account of every individual it had ever interacted with. They recognize each other by individual contact calls, not unlike the way a human instantly recognizes a familiar voice in a crowded room. Acoustic studies revealed each bat carries a unique vocal signature, one that its roost companions learn to identify over months and years together. More remarkably, they remember precisely who shared with them and who did not across remarkably long stretches of time. Wilkinson documented stable sharing pairs lasting years, a web of trust built slowly, interaction by interaction. over entire lifetimes. This was not random behavior or simple instinct. This was a maintained social network, sustained by memory and deliberate choice. But what principle governed this network, and how did it avoid collapsing under the weight of those who only take and never give? To understand that mechanism, we need to enter what biology calls reciprocal altruism and why it almost never works in nature. Reciprocal altruism means one individual accepts a small cost, now expecting repayment later from the one it helped. The theory had existed since the 1970s, but truly convincing field evidence for it in the wild had remained almost impossibly rare. The problem is that this theory is easily destroyed by cheaters, individuals who accept help indefinitely and never repay it. If cheaters go unpunished, the entire system eventually collapses because no individual can afford to keep giving to those who never reciprocate. So how does a vampire bat colony solve this problem? And the answer lies in a mechanism of remarkable precision. That mechanism is not blind instinct. It rests on something we have long assumed belonged to humans alone. That mechanism is social punishment. Vampire bats withhold sharing from individuals who have previously failed to reciprocate. Even more remarkable, they track this not only from their own direct experience with that individual. Recent studies show they also observe how individuals treat others nearby, a genuine form of social learning about reputation. In other words, they track the social reputation of every colony member, not just their own private history with that individual. This is the foundation of what psychologists call reputational morality, one of the cornerstones of human social organization. But this mechanism can only function if three very specific conditions are met within the colony at the same time. The first condition, the colony must be small enough that every individual can recognize and remember every other member personally. The second condition, individuals must meet often enough that their shared history of interactions carries real practical weight over time. The third condition, the cost of giving must be low enough that the donor is not putting its own survival at mortal risk. Vampire bats satisfy all three conditions simultaneously, and this combination is extraordinarily rare across the natural world. But the sharing mechanism does not stop at blood. That is only the visible surface of a far deeper system of bonding. Before blood is shared, two bats typically spend several minutes in mutual grooming, a ritual of physical contact that precedes and predicts generosity. Studies show that time spent grooming predicts blood sharing more reliably than genetic kinship. Closeness is built, not born. Closeness within the colony is not simply inherited, it is earned, built, and maintained through consistent acts of care over time. And the hormone underlying that bond, according to recent studies, is not foreign to the human brain at all. It is oxytocin, the same hormone released when humans embrace, when a mother nurses her child, when trust is extended to another. Vampire bats are using the same hormonal language to build trust that humans use to form lover chemistry older than either species. But this system has its limits, boundaries that even the most sophisticated trust network in nature cannot fully transcend. New colony members can take many months to build enough interaction history before they gain access to the network's protection. And it is precisely here that researchers began arguing over a question with no easy answer. The question was this: does what vampire bats do resemble what we call morality closely enough to deserve the same name? One group of scientists argued that morality requires consciousness, and bats cannot possess consciousness in any full sense. The opposing group countered that if behavior is structured, remembered, and enforced with punishment, the line separating it from morality becomes very thin indeed. And here science must honestly admit it does not yet have the tools to answer this question definitively, only the data and the debate. What we can say with certainty is that this behavior evolved at least 12 million years before the first humans appeared on Earth. That places an uncomfortable evolutionary paradox before anyone who would argue that morality belongs exclusively to humankind. If morality is a product of evolution, why would it appear in only one species out of 8 million that have ever existed on this planet? Some primatologists, like Frans de Waal, argued that morality is not a human invention, but an inheritance shared across all social mammals. And the vampire bat became one of the hardest pieces of evidence to argue against in support of that position. But there is another paradox inside their system that receives far less attention, and it makes the debate even harder to resolve. Vampire bats sometimes share with complete strangers, newly arrived individuals with no history of interaction with the donor whatsoever. This cannot be explained by pure reciprocal altruism because there is no history from which to predict any future repayment. Some researchers describe this as evidence of something closer to compassion giving because the other is in need, not because repayment is expected. Others caution that this is a case of humans projecting their own emotional categories onto animal behavior that may have a simpler explanation. And here science must stand still for a moment and acknowledge that our language may not yet be adequate for this question. No one knows whether a bat feels anything approaching empathy. No one can enter its nervous system and verify what is happening inside. But what is observed from the outside behavior that is repeated, structured, enforced, and extended even to strangers is not a small thing. Gerry Carter's experiments in 2013 at Ohio State University added yet another layer of complexity to an already difficult question. Carter isolated pairs of bats that were strangers to each other, forcing them through a shared period of food deprivation in the same enclosure. After feeding resumed, pairs that had shared the starvation period together began sharing blood at dramatically higher rates than control groups. Sharing adversity together, even for just a few days, was sufficient to generate a genuine bond of trust between two complete strangers. If that sounds familiar, it is because the same psychological mechanism has been documented repeatedly in soldiers, disaster survivors, and people who have passed through crisis together. We are beginning to see something larger than a story about bats, what science calls the deep architecture of social life itself. Trust networks, punishment of cheaters, shared adversity, individual recognition, reputation management. This is the ingredient list of any society that lasts. And this bat weighing about 1 ounce assembled that entire list without philosophy, without law, without religion. This forces us to ask a very fundamental question: is morality a cultural invention, or is it a biological structure older than culture itself? Primatologist Frans de Waal called these foundational behaviors the floor of morality, the biological layer beneath every human rule system. Vampire bats may not access abstract concepts, but they operate on exactly that foundational floor every single night they are alive. And here the story of the bat becomes the story of us, in a way that cannot be easily dismissed. The human brain and the vampire bat brain share a neural structure called the amygdala, processing both fear and social trust through the same ancient circuitry. Oxytocin flows in both brains when social bonds form. Serotonin regulates social behavior in both species, the same molecules doing the same ancient work. That does not mean bats and humans are the same, but it does mean both are running on the same ancient evolutionary hardware at their deepest level. When we build social insurance systems, when we create community funds, when we help strangers after disasters, what exactly are we doing? We may be running the same biological algorithm that vampire bats have been executing continuously for 12 million years before us. We just call it by different names: law, religion, welfare, charity, solidarity, depending on the culture and the century. And the vampire bat, feared and reviled by humanity across centuries, turns out to have been running that principle more consistently than many human societies ever have. No member starves alone when it can be prevented. No network collapses under unpunished exploitation. The system holds because every individual is accountable. The system stands because every individual carries genuine responsibility for the survival of those beside it, not by rule, but by memory and choice. Not because any written law commands it, but because the memory of every individual is the mortar that holds the entire structure in place. And this is the final thing, that the science of the vampire bat reminds us something very simple that we often lose sight of completely. No society, human or animal, can sustain itself across time without a functioning system for sharing risk among its members. And that system does not need to be elaborate. It only needs to be built on genuine memory and genuine accountability, one interaction at a time. Vampire bats have known this for 12 million years, and their network is still standing tonight, in the same darkness, on the same ancient stone. In total darkness, right now, a bat is starving toward the edge of death, hanging from a cave ceiling in Costa Rica, and within minutes, another will come to it, not because it was commanded to, but because it remembers. It remembers that the night before, the one now starving was the one who gave when the roles were reversed and the outcome hung on memory alone. This is not a miracle. It is not divine. It is ancient biological architecture functioning exactly as evolution designed it to function. But looking at it, one cannot help asking whether what we call morality began exactly here, in this darkness, 12 million years before we named it. And if so, then the grand names we give it, morality, humanity, civilization, may be nothing more than newer shadows cast by something far older than any of our words. In total darkness, what holds a society together is not law, not philosophy, but a bat that remembers that last night someone saved its life.